We have about half an hour for questions, and I'd like to open up with one about the new tools that you mentioned at the start of your talk. You said that there'll be a great need for skills like statistics and decision theory and the ability to criticize a scientific study. These are things in the British education system that are very easy to opt out of. They tend to be voluntary things you come to at the age of about 16, and a lot of people do opt out of them. Perhaps because they think these things are great, but I don't need them. They're not necessary for my personal future.
Right.
Are they right? Is it possible that these are going to be essential skills, but maybe only for 10 or 20% of the population, and they're just not a good investment of time for some young people?
Psychologists, make up tests, just like I could make it from this test. I mean, suppose somebody interviewed, suppose somebody, et cetera. And we ask them these questions. Over a 2-year period, psychologists gain 70% more ability to answer these questions, and of the kind we talked about today. Social science students gain also about 40%. Chemistry students and literature students learn nothing whatsoever. They gain absolutely nothing. And these data are what happens with 2 years of graduate school in law, medicine, psychology, or chemistry. The psychologists gain another 70%. It's just enormous. To my surprise, doctors gain a fair amount. I didn't think that would happen, so I went to medical school for a few days, and the mystery went away. They're constantly talking in benefit, cost terms, and probabilities. Say, which do you think, here's symptom A and B, does the patient have disease X or Y? And the student says, I think the student that has X. And the professor says, wrong. Because X, disease X, is very difficult to diagnose. The tests for it are unreliable. Any treatment you might give is not likely to be much better than doing nothing at all. So it's constant use of probabilistic, statistical, and scientific methodological principles applied to homely, ordinary medical problems. Now, the interesting thing, it completely escapes that. And I don't ask any medical problems. It completely escapes that and goes into everyday life. Now, can you do better than undergraduate schools or graduate schools are doing? My joke about statistics, as it's taught in undergraduate school, is that it's taught so as to prevent, if at all possible, its escape into everyday life. It's also about agricultural yields and IQ test scores and so on. And if you ask people in these fields, professors in these fields, you say, why don't you give examples in everyday life? They say, look, it's hard enough to do this thing anyway. This is what I learned in school about statistics, and this is what you got to learn at this level. You're not doing your job. But I started trying to teach people these concepts in the laboratory. People who had not had statistics or who had not had economics. And I started out thinking, our intuitive ways of reasoning they're very effective for all kinds of things, but they're not useful for certain things. They'll cause us to get the right answer. But I think these things are so wired that you're not going to be able to much affect them by instruction. Well, the first thing I found out was totally wrong, and the courses will do it. We may add a lot. But in the laboratory, we did 2 different kinds of training. Either we gave people simply abstract descriptions of principles, like the law of large numbers. Say every observation can be thought of as truth corpus, error, and sample and population, and so on, and then let them loose on a number of everyday life problems. And they got really better after 10 minutes of abstract teaching. Or we gave them 10 minutes of examples, of the kind of concrete examples that I gave just now. And again, they got better, and they're additive. Each contributes to something different. and it lasts because we call them up several weeks after they've been in our study, pretending to be a pollster, asking them questions, public policy questions, personal questions, and we have some target questions where if they've got a particular principle, they'll apply it there. And there's very significant gain after this. Now, what I want to do is to go back to professors and say, you're wrong that you can't teach this stuff, and you're probably wrong in thinking that it adds time and takes away from the total amount that can be taught. I understand the law of large numbers vastly better than I used to because I'm thinking about them and about everyday life events. I mean, all of these things come alive. You understand them better if you apply them in a couple of everyday life problems. So.
Do we have a question from the audience?
You gave the example of two physics paper evaluated by two reviewers, and there is very little correlation as to how they review it, and in other disciplines the same. Now, this is really quite worrying if there is no objective level for these things. But even more worrying is, say, people who govern us, you know, like in government, when they evaluate situations, how do they make decisions, and do they make the best decisions?
Well, I think we all know the answer to that. But what are some of the ways that decisions can go wrong? There's a wonderful book by a social psychologist named Irving Janis, who gave rise to, you probably heard the term, how many people have heard the term groupthink? Yeah, he gave rise to the term. He looked at the way political leaders made various decisions. He looked at some really terrible decisions, like Kennedy's Bay of Pig decision to send in 2,000 troops into Cuba with no air support, which was just astonishingly bad decision. And he looked at good decisions made by those same people. So he looked at a couple of excellent decisions that were made by Kennedy and so on to find out what some of the differences are. One of the main differences is that almost surely a part of the problem with Kennedy's Bay of Pig decision, it came very early on. The military presents their plan. You know, people are nervous, they don't want to speak up, and so air cover. So they're trying to maintain their prestige. It's risky. What am I? I'm an economist. I'm going to criticize the general. Kennedy actually instituted something which could be used by every decision-making body. He appointed, which actually the first use of it, so far as I know, comes from the Vatican, and the term there is the devil's advocate. He appointed someone to be the critic, and he had, no matter what is suggested, I want you to say what's wrong with it. So that's one kind of way that decisions go wrong. But policy makes, I didn't to talk about the political costs. We have something called Head Start in the US, which is a program for poor minority kids, pre-K program. It was started 50 years ago. $200 billion have been spent, and we have no idea whether it has any effect, because there's never been random assignment to condition. We do know that almost certainly programs differ a lot in quality and in type of thing that goes on. Some may well be doing good, but we can't know because there wasn't random assignment. On 9/11, there were 9,000 grief counselors who descended on New York to help folks out. Grief counseling is a very reasonable sounding thing to me. You get a small group of people, they tell what their experiences are, what their feelings are. The leader assures people that these feelings are normal, and then in the not too distant future, they're going to be much better off. This actually increases the length of distress, period of distress, somewhat for people. Who knows why? Assumptions tend to be wrong. Sounds like a great idea to me. It's not. There were some prisoners in New Jersey a while back who decided that they would like to take at-risk youth and tell them how horrible it is in prison. So they brought junior high kids in. And you can't believe it's incredibly boring. The food is horrible. There's constant fighting. There's sexual abuse, and so on. This increases the likelihood that these kids will commit crimes. It's been estimated that for every dollar spent on what are called scared straight, people familiar with that term, scared straight? A few. Every dollar spent on scared straight costs society $140 in incarceration costs and crime costs. So our societies are not making decisions on the basis of these. However, Britain is actually way ahead of the curve. Somebody knows here what the panel is of behavioral scientists who are involved, who are presumably reviewing, just operating like the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors. That's what's the Council of Behavioral Science. Does anybody know what the name of that group is?
Nudge Unit.
What's that?
The Nudge Unit is colloquially named.
What is it?
It's called the Nudge Unit.
Oh, I see. Okay. After Nudge, the guy who invented the economic concept of lots of things you can do to push people in a direction that's better for them and better for the society. A very clever guy came up with a lot of these concepts. Name is Richard Thaler. And so he was an advisor to the British government. The US government has now set up something like, but it's like weeks old. And I think it's going to make a huge difference because I said a lot of things today that are relevant to thinking about public policy.
Should we go up to the gods somewhere? Yes.
If you spent 10,000 hours making furniture, and then you start for another 10,000 hours, would you go back to being terrible?
I'm sure I wouldn't be terrible. I doubt that 10,000 hours would actually get me up to anything other than so-so. So, I mean, there's such a thing as having too many thumbs. So.
It was just a question about was it Gladwell said if you practice for 10,000 hours, you'll be a master, etc.
Right.
I love regression of the mean.
I love Malcolm Gladwell. I think I love his books. They teach me things as a psychologist. That particular claim of his, I don't much care for. 10,000 hours required to be an expert in chess. Well, maybe 10,000 hours required for tiddlywinks. I mean, he asserts every skill. It's 10,000 hours. And I don't think there are very few psychologists who believe that you can give any number that would apply to all kinds of skills.
Anybody on this side? Yes, at the back.
As you spoke at the beginning a lot about people being smart or smarter. Now, do you make a distinction between smartness, intelligence, wisdom, and cleverness?
Yes, I do. I actually have started studying wisdom, and it came from my study of Eastern versus Western ways of reasoning, and they are quite dramatically different in some important respects. Westerners are very good at logic, at analysis, at categorization, but they make a lot of errors because they don't do something that's more characteristic of Easterners, which is to pay much more attention to context. The simplest demonstration we have of this is if you show Japanese and Americans 20-second videos of underwater scenes, and then you turn it off and you ask them, what did they see? The Americans will say, I saw 3 big fish swimming off to the left. They had white bellies with pink stipples on them. The Japanese will almost invariably start by saying, with context, I saw what looked like a stream. The water was green. There were rocks and shells on the bottom. There were 3 big fish swimming off to the right. They actually produce 60% more information about context than the Americans do, at no cost to what they're able to do for the most salient object. But Americans are just, and if you put a gizmo on people, it will show where they're looking at a picture. The Americans are looking at the central object. The Asians are looking at the object context, object context, object context. And they literally remember the object in context, so that if you show Americans an object that they have seen before in a different context and ask them if they've seen it, they're just as likely to be correct as if you show it to them in the original context. But it throws the Japanese off. If you show that object in a different context, that's something different. That's not the object they saw. They saw the object in a particular context. But the point is much more general than this, because they're much more attentive to historical context, temporal context. They're much more attuned to social cues than Westerners. And a lot of this, as far as I'm concerned, it counts as wisdom. So we started looking at people's responses to questions about social conflict, societal conflict and individual conflict. The individual conflict were drawn from the advice columns. Dear Abby, it is in the US. We literally just used those columns. And then we scored them for things like perspective taking. Do they take more than one perspective? Do they come up with, do they assume that things are probably going to change, which I think is wiser than just assuming that it's going to be static? Do they recognize possibilities for compromise in conflict and so on? And the first thing we found, we did the study first with Americans, is that Americans get wiser as they get older. And believe it or not, this is the only study that actually shows that. Other people show it, but they look at the populations, they look at a bunch of university freshmen and some old folks knitting doilies, and they find that sometimes they find they're wiser, usually they don't. We did a random sample, and if you don't do a random sample, you can't answer that question. So we did find that Americans get wiser. Young Japanese are substantially wiser than young Americans by these measures. But they don't get wiser as they get older. From age 25 to age 75, they get no wiser. Now, why is this? I think it's because East Asian society emphasizes harmony, getting along, reducing conflict, finding compromise, and so on. This is part of the socialization of young Japanese. So they really are wiser than Westerners are. Americans don't get that. We keep making mistakes, creating conflicts, handling conflicts badly, but we do learn from it. So, and actually, 75-year-old Americans are just as wise as 75-year-old Japanese, but they sure got there a lot quicker. So,
can we go up to the balcony again? At the back of the middle.
What happened to Trump? I've got a serious question. Would you agree or not that with the development of science, by which I would include understanding of statistics and the wider realms of education, that the political system, in terms that we have it at the moment, will become obsolete?
the what system?
Political system. Sorry, the political system that we have at the moment in terms of left-wing, right-wing would become obsolete with the development of science and education.
Well, I think all political systems are obsolete, and the British is the least obsolete because they are making use there in a systematic way of these kinds of principles in making government decisions at least. Now, would full appreciation of these things result? Would it be a pressure toward change? I don't know, that's a very complicated. I will just say that there's another sense in which I think the British political system is superior to ours, and that is there's this principle in technology that the people who do it first, that's great, they benefit from that, but then they're locked into it, and other people are saying, oh, we can do the technology better. So the US at one point had absolutely the best political system, amazingly better than anybody else's political system, but a better way was then found, better way than the presidential way, which is the parliamentary way. Richard Nixon wouldn't have lasted a month after the tapes were discovered in a parliamentary system. You may be having changes in your own parliamentary system in the offing. But this is a case of, the important point here being expertise. I mean, if voters, let's face it, I mean, look who they're going for in the US right now. It's absolutely astonishing. I mean, and our only salvation is that fortunately, the delegates to the convention are only bound on the first ballot. So they can vote for whom they want to after that. But you want people who are expert in judging political quality making the decisions, which in the case of parliamentary system is the politicians, their peers.
We have time, I think, for one last question.
You said that you should involve lots of people in making investment decisions, but anyone who's been in committees with lots of people find that they're terribly inefficient. So how do you structure an effective investment or a decision-making body?
Right. Well, actually, this hedge fund that I went to, I thought it was the best decision-making procedure I'd ever seen because they would get the two most expert people to make their evaluations of a particular thing. And they're constantly, if you got two people, you're going to get a larger set of questions raised on average than would be the case if there was just one person. So they're asking more questions. They're entering into a dialogue, which is almost surely going to, I mean, I'm often finding that what I believe is wrong because I hear myself saying it to someone, say, oh no, that's, and even if the other person doesn't recognize it, which the other person may, in which case is a double benefit. So there's that. And then they present their analysis and the reasons for it to the entire group. It's a group of about 15 people. So they can bring in expertise from various ways. I can't tell you how superior that is to the way the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Mental Health make their decisions about grant proposals. The National Institute of Health has two people and only two people. And in my field, the decision is then made not just by social psychologists, but by anthropologists and sociologists, and who are, you know, I've literally heard one say once, I like the name on this proposal, I'm going to vote for it. I mean, that, so there are much superior ways. More people is almost always going to be, other things equal, more people is better than less people.
Well, I hope that this evening has left you, if not smarter, then certainly wiser to our collective cognitive bad habits. Please join me in thanking Professor Nisbett. Thank you. Thank you.